In the entire sweep of medieval warfare, few moments stand out like this one, a clash where one of the largest armies in the Near East collided with a kingdom barely hanging on by a thread. And at the center of it all stood a boy who, by every law of nature, should have been dying. This is the legend of King Baldwin IV, the Leper King, 16 years old, hands wrapped in bloody bandages, nerves decaying, face hidden behind a gleaming silver mask. By all logic, he should have been bedridden, yet history placed him on a horse, riding straight toward one of the most feared commanders the medieval world had ever produced. Because across the desert sands, gathering like a storm, was Saladin, the sword of Islam. Saladin, a conqueror at the absolute height of his power, a man who commanded the combined strength of Egypt and Syria with over 100,000 warriors at his call and 26,000 elite troops advancing with him at Montgisard. Until this moment, he had never been defeated. Castles surrendered at the sound of his name. Cities opened their gates without a fight. His reputation alone could empty entire valleys. The stage was set for what should have been a massacre. A teenage boy with failing hands and a dwindling kingdom facing a war machine that had never known failure. And yet, this is where the story turns. Because Saladin, confident and unstoppable, made his first fatal mistake. He bypassed strongholds, stretched his forces thin, and marched toward Jerusalem, believing the city's fall was inevitable. His sweeping campaign was meant to be a triumphal procession, but instead, it delivered him into the jaws of one of the greatest military upsets in the medieval world. And at Montgisard, under a burning sky, the impossible happened. This wasn't just a battle. It was a moment when faith confronted fate, when a dying boy became a symbol, and when the greatest commander of his age tasted defeat for the first time. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. Had Saladin crushed Baldwin here, the Crusader States may have collapsed decades earlier. Jerusalem might have fallen in 1177, not 1187, and the entire course of Middle Eastern and European history could have shifted. Instead, a Leper King, mounted on a war horse he could barely grip, changed the destiny of his kingdom and humiliated a legend. What happened next was nothing short of madness or genius. Instead of hiding behind Jerusalem's crumbling walls, Baldwin chose a move so reckless it bordered on suicidal. He forced his tiny army to march 45 miles in just 36 hours, a pace brutal even for the healthiest knights. And Baldwin was a king whose body was literally decaying beneath his armor. But this gamble had purpose. Baldwin knew Saladin had grown overconfident. The Muslim army, convinced the Crusaders were finished, had spread out across the countryside near Montgisard, foraging, relaxing, and letting discipline slip. No one expected a counterattack, especially not from a dying teenager. When Baldwin's scouts surveyed the landscape, what they found felt like divine intervention. Saladin's troops were scattered, unprepared, and camped across terrible terrain. Ravines, gullies, dead ground where an army could be trapped and crushed. And this is where Baldwin's brilliance cut through the madness. He realized that if he struck now, fast and violently, the terrain and chaos would multiply the power of his vastly outnumbered force. It was a desperate gamble, but the only chance to stop one of the largest armies in the Near East from marching straight into Jerusalem. On November 25th, 1177, as the afternoon sun burned across the plains of Montgisard, Baldwin IV raised his bandaged hand and gave the signal. At 2 p.m., the ground began to tremble. 500 knights, led by 80 fanatical, battle-hardened Templars, launched themselves down the ridge in a charge so reckless, so unthinkable, that even seasoned warriors struggled to believe it was happening. These were men who had marched 45 miles in 36 hours, who had slept little, eaten less, and were now hurtling toward an army 52 times their size. Many were weakened from heat and fatigue. Some were barely conscious. And yet they lowered their lances and accelerated into the largest Muslim field army ever faced by the Crusader States. What followed was psychological devastation. Saladin's troops were relaxed, scattered, and unprepared. For days they had been foraging freely, certain the Crusader kingdom was collapsing. Even the elite Mamluks, veterans of battles in Africa, Syria, and the Byzantine frontier, momentarily froze. The question rippled through their ranks. What kind of madmen charged straight into 26,000? The shock alone fractured the cohesion of Saladin's center. But the terrain made the disaster far worse. Ravines cut through the battlefield, invisible from Saladin's command position, slicing his army into segments that could not reinforce one another. Baldwin's infantry had been concealed, held back until the perfect moment. When they appeared later on the flanks, many Muslims believed new Crusader forces had arrived. And at the front, the Templars did the unthinkable. They didn't stop after impact. They smashed into the vanguard and kept plowing forward, hacking their way deeper, turning confusion into chaos and chaos into terror. But the moment that broke morale was Baldwin himself. Strapped to his saddle so he wouldn't fall, his hands wrapped in blood-soaked cloth, the young king rode at the head of the charge. Chroniclers, Christian and Muslim alike, record that they saw him lift his sword, pale and shaking under the mask that hid his ravaged face. A dying boy leading from the absolute front against impossible odds. That sight alone rippled through Saladin's army like a supernatural omen. If the Leper King himself was charging, what force was driving him? And for the first time in his career, Saladin's invincible army began to break. Once the Templars shattered the center, the real destruction began. Baldwin's secular knights, those who had been holding back just long enough for the Templars to punch a hole, now slammed into the breach. It created a second shockwave, doubling the panic already rippling through Saladin's unprepared lines. What had begun as confusion now spiraled into total psychological collapse. At that exact moment, Baldwin's hidden 3,000 infantry appeared on the flank, a maneuver so perfectly timed that Saladin's army became convinced they were being encircled. From a distance, it looked like fresh reinforcements had arrived. The illusion was devastating. The breakdown spread like wildfire. First, Mamluks began to fall back, those same elite warriors celebrated across the Islamic world for their discipline. Then entire regiments followed, collapsing inward, tripping over each other, losing formation, losing nerve. And then came the unthinkable. Saladin's own personal guard, 2,000 elite warriors sworn to die before seeing him harmed, broke ranks and fled. In the midst of the chaos, Saladin himself made the most humiliating decision of his career. He abandoned his war horse, jumped onto a racing camel, and fled the battlefield at full speed, a moment so shocking that Muslim chroniclers wrote of it with pain and disbelief. What began as a retreat turned into a slaughter. Baldwin's knights pursued the routing army for miles. The very ravines Saladin had ignored on the march now became death traps. Trampled bodies piled at the bottoms of gullies. Men suffocated in choke points. Thousands died without a sword ever touching them, killed by panic alone. By 4:30 p.m., the battlefield had been reduced to a vision of apocalypse. Of Saladin's 26,000 troops, barely 2,000 remained alive. The ground was so thick with corpses that chroniclers said knights had to pick their steps carefully just to move. Templars fought with anything they could find: maces, broken sword hilts, even helmets, after their blades shattered from constant impact. The pursuit only stopped for one reason. The Crusader horses collapsed from exhaustion, unable to run another step. The invincible army of Saladin was gone. The Leper King's tiny force had triumphed against impossible odds. The shockwaves of Montgisard hit instantly. Baldwin's tiny kingdom suddenly struck gold, literally. The Crusaders captured Saladin's entire war chest, enough weapons to equip multiple armies, thousands of prized Arabian horses, and so much treasure that the once broke kingdom of Jerusalem became financially stable overnight. For Saladin, the defeat was catastrophic. His prestige shattered, his alliances wavered, his army, once seen as unstoppable, was gone. It took him a full decade to rebuild his strength. Both sides believed something supernatural had happened. Muslim chroniclers called the defeat divine punishment. Christian writers called it nothing short of miraculous. Jerusalem erupted into 3 days of celebration, but Baldwin didn't share in the joy. His body, pushed past human limits, collapsed after the battle. Even so, he insisted on leading the victory prayers, whispering, "Not to us, O Lord, but to your name give glory." Baldwin IV reigned for 8 more brutal years, blind, crippled, and in constant agony, yet still terrifying enough that even Saladin later confessed, "I feared that man more than any army." But Baldwin's death in 1185 ended the miracle. Without his mind and will, the Crusader States unraveled. Saladin recaptured Jerusalem just 2 years later. Montgisard remains one of history's clearest examples of morale beating mathematics, tactical brilliance overwhelming numbers, belief and desperation turning the impossible into reality. The story closes on a single question. Did Baldwin rise to meet destiny, or did destiny choose him? Either way, Montgisard became the last great Christian battlefield victory in the Holy Land. A reminder that courage can defy overwhelming odds, but not forever.